Hello and welcome to this week's Salon, where we bring together expert guests to discuss careers and research topics that challenge, inspire and hopefully inform as well. I'm Adam Smith, I'm the Programme Director for Dementia Researcher, and I'll be your host for today's session. My guest, you can turn your cameras on now, it's all good. Today we're unlocking the secrets to successful grant applications with two fantastic speakers who have first-hand experience reviewing bids for some of the biggest research funders. So whether you're preparing your first submission or looking to refine your approach, this is a great opportunity to gain some insider insight into the review process and get some practical tips to make your next application a success. Joining us are Professor Patrick Lewis from the Royal Veterinary College, who's a neurodegeneration researcher with extensive experience mentoring PhD students and early career researchers, and also has sat on many grant review boards. And we have Dr. Rachael Kelley, who's a reader at Leeds University with a research focus on dementia care, and also a member of or just finished your tenure as a member of a major grant review board. Each of our speakers will share their thoughts. For those of you who don't know, how the format of this works is each of our two speakers take a turn to present 10 minutes, and they're going to share their thoughts. They've been given a very wide mandate and remit on what they can talk about, and then we'll have a chance for you to post questions as well, which I'll put to Rachael and Patrick. And then if we have time, we'll join you in the chat as well, where you can, we'll share some links to some other resources and things that we've got useful. But I should add at the start, we have a ton of resources on this particular topic on our website as well. So do, after the show, make sure you go over to our website and have a look. We've talked about this before in our podcast. We've got numerous blogs on this topic as well. And of course, our website also curates all the dementia research funding opportunities all into one place, so you can find a grant to actually apply for in the first place. But that's enough from me. Rachel's going to go first. Do you want to share your slides, Rachael? This worked perfectly in rehearsals.
What could go wrong? Should be on their way to you now. Can you see those?
We can. So over to you, Rachael. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Adam. And hello to you all. As Adam said, my name's Rachael Kelley and I work in the Centre for Dementia Research at Leeds University. I also sit and have sat on quite a few different grant funding panels. So I'm going to draw a bit on that today and give you some insider tips to how the review process works and some top tips in terms of putting together a really good grant application with a little bit of help from a few Sylvanian families. So that will become a bit clearer along the way. So I'm just going to move my slides on. There we go. So just briefly, why am I here? I thought it might just be a little bit helpful to give you a sense of why I'm here talking to you today and what sort of experience I've gained, both in terms of research funding, but also research reviewing, because I think that is my first top tip, really. That's one of the ways that I've really got a really good sense of how to put together a really good grant application is by sitting on funding panels, observing them to start with, and just seeing what sort of things make a really good application, what sorts of mistakes do I sometimes see people making as well. So there's nothing better, I think, than getting to be part of the process if and when that's a good timing for you, because I've learned an awful lot from doing that. But from this slide, you can see then so that I've had sort of quite a lot of different funding panel experience on the right-hand side there, and sort of dipping in and out and observing to start with, which is often an opportunity that is available on some funding panels. It really helped me then to start to get a sense of what that process is like and whether it was something I wanted to do more of. So I've now sat on quite a few funding panels, predominantly from the NIHR as a result of that early experience, and I've really enjoyed that. And I've also had over time a developing and growing body of research funding as well. So I think working with other people with more experience of obtaining grants has been one way that I've learned a lot about how to put a good application together. And I think you can also see from looking down that list of funding there how often people might start out quite small, and that's absolutely fine. You don't need to be going necessarily for a big grant to start with. You can learn a lot from smaller pockets of money that start to show that you've got experience and expertise in developing funding applications. And that's something else funders are looking for. Are they funding somebody who's managed a grant or been involved in grants before, so they know they've got a sense of how to develop a project and see it through to the end as well? So that would be a couple of my first top tips. Start out smaller if you need to, and potentially consider getting some experience of actually observing or being involved in funding panels or reviewing applications at some point. So a little bit about how funding panels may work. It comes with the caveat that obviously I'm drawing on experiences that I've had. Patrick may well come along shortly and say something a little bit different because he's been involved in different funding panels. But from my experience, this is sort of how they tend to work. So you'll have a group of people sat around the table. I only had about 10 or so Sylvanian families, but imagine more about 20 in reality. Before the funding panel happens, all the applications received will have been triaged ahead of time by the funders. So some may have already been wheedled out at that stage if perhaps they haven't met the requirements of the funder. Then, ahead of the meeting, there will usually be 2 to 3 people who are allocated some applications to read in more detail. And I think that's really important to know, because there's 2 or 3 people that are going to be reviewing your application in more depth. You can see I've labelled them there, reviewers 1, 2 and 3. They may often have particular jobs or things they're looking out for, and that's certainly the case on the funding panels I've sat on. So often one of those reviewers, their main role is to review the application for the quality of the PPI, the patient and public engagement work. So that really needs to be high quality in your application. That would be a tip from me, because somebody has got particular eyes on your application just for that element of it and how good that involvement has been. There may well also now be a reviewer who is particularly asked to focus on EDI, so the equality, diversity and inclusion within your application. So again, that needs to be strong and clear throughout it as well. But what will happen generally is those 3 people will review the application in more detail, and it'll be their job to present it to the rest of the panel, so the rest of the Sylvanian families sat at that panel meeting. That may mean that the rest of the Sylvanian families have not had time to read your application in as much depth as the 3 reviewers have, because they'll have been reviewing other applications. So that's where your job is to make what you're planning to do as clear as it possibly can be, because probably reviewer 1 will summarise the application for the rest of the panel, and they'll provide a summary of the key strengths and key areas for improvement, or where there's some questions perhaps. That means you need to help them, make it really easy for them to summarise it. Make sure your plain English summary, or whatever summary of the research you're asked to provide, is really clear and easy, because that might be what they turn back to summarise the project for the rest of the panel. It may well also be what the rest of the panel, the rest of the Sylvanian families around the table, have the time to read. It's certainly what people normally read first. So that would be a top tip, is to really not leave that bit of the application to the end, which is what people often do. Make sure your summary of your project is really clear. What will happen at the end of that sort of process, so that each reviewer will give some feedback on the application. It will then open perhaps to the rest of the floor for anyone else to add in any other questions or areas they wanted to highlight of either strengths or perhaps areas for improvement. They'll then all vote on the application. They'll have some sort of scoring system, and they'll do that same process for all of the applications. So the outcome of that meeting will either be that your application is perhaps recommended for funding, or invited back to a second stage if the funder has a 2-stage process, which is certainly quite common in the NIHR, or your application may be rejected at that point. I think it's important to know that every panel member gets a vote, whether they've had time to read the full application or just the summary of it and to hear other people's thoughts on it. And they've got a lot of applications to review. So the time spent discussing each application could be as little as 10 minutes or maybe up to 15 or so. So it isn't very long, which is why what you're doing needs to be really clear and really easy to follow. They may or may not have expertise in the particular topic or methods as well. So you need to make sure it's really clear. There isn't jargon in there. What you're doing is really, really straightforward. You'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner in that picture there that there's 2 people, Mr. and Mrs. Hedgehog, who are not sat around the table. Now, they're quite important. There's usually people who'll be what's called conflicted on each application, and there'll be people that know perhaps one or more of the applicants. They may have worked with them, they may work in the same department as them, they may have collaborated with them on a grant, for example. They are not allowed to review that application because they have a conflict of interest. You know, they may like you and be more likely to want to support your application and score it highly, or may have some kind of issue, who knows, and actually likely to score it the other way. But either way, it's not a fair assessment. So they'll be asked to sit out of that particular application. Now, those people could be quite helpful to you, because if they sit on the funding panel and they know how it works, but they're not allowed to sit in on your application, maybe they'd be happy to have a bit of a chat with you about it beforehand, about what sorts of things to make sure you consider when putting in an application to that funder, some top tips for you maybe. So if there's somebody that you know, well worth potentially approaching if you're considering applying to that funder, because they could be really helpful to you. So here's some top tips then for writing a good application for a funding panel. Make sure you start early. First of all, I'd say at least 9 months or more, because it takes so long to pull an application together. There's so many elements to it, so give it the time that it needs. And then it's about being really clear on what you're including. And I've included some key things here that I think it's important to be clear about. So make sure, first of all, you're including what is actually asked for. Read the guidance really clearly. Look at what they're looking for, perhaps look at some examples of other grant applications to the same funder, and make sure you include what they're asking you to include. Make sure the importance of the topic is really clear. You know, if it aligns with the priorities of the funder, or perhaps certain bodies, such as the James Lind Alliance or the NHS, make sure that is really, really clear. Why is this such an important thing to be looking at? Make sure you've got really good PPI and EDI plans, a really clear written summary, as I mentioned before, and most importantly, I think, make sure the whole application is really clear and easy to follow. You use headings, leave white space. If there's more than one work package, have good links between one and the other, so the purpose is really clear throughout. I think that's one of the most important areas that applications fall down on sometimes. And then also the sort of what's the point element of it. So make the dissemination and the impact of the work really clear. What's the point? So what is it going to lead to? The team's important to consider as well. Make sure you've got a really experienced team that cover all the different elements of expertise that are needed to do the piece of work, and with enough time allocated to it as well. And then make sure you've got a really feasible plan for the project. So is it going to be doable in the time that you've got? The other thing to mention is if it's a 2-stage process, you'll get feedback most likely after stage 1. It's really crucial to respond to that feedback really well. What that feedback essentially is the panel saying, these are things we've got questions about and we're not sure about. And they are obviously the people that are going to ultimately make the decision on whether or not it's funded. So you need to make sure you respond to their feedback really well, really carefully consider it. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it. But if you want to say, actually, no, it is really important to do it the way that we've said, then just make that really clear. So don't overlook the importance of that. And the last thing I was going to say then was just a few common reasons I think that research panels might reject an application. There might be other reasons as well, but here's some common things just to be mindful of. It could be the research team is perhaps too small or doesn't have the expertise that's needed, and there's just some concerns around their ability to deliver the project. So giving them the money feels a bit of a risk. If the problem or need for this research just hasn't really been made clear, if the proposal's overly ambitious really for the time or the budget that's available, and related to that, then perhaps if it's not felt to be value for money, it's not delivering enough for the amount of money being asked for. Probably most importantly, as I said before, that research design isn't clear or has big flaws or limitations in it that aren't, it's not feasible to change in the time that's available. So perhaps between stage 1 and stage 2, for example, there's more work needed than there's time to give. And then lastly, that the proposal doesn't have enough input from PPI members or other key stakeholders. There's lots of help out there to avoid these limitations and get these things right. There's a couple of links there at the bottom. There's the Research Support Service, who are absolutely brilliant and can help you. The NIHR, for example, have lots of guidance and help around EDI and PPI. So ask for help and use the help that's out there. And lastly, just to say, I think it's a really valuable process, regardless of whether or not you get funded. don't take it personally if you're not. There's still an awful lot you can get out of it. And a lot of people come back a second time if they've been rejected a first time round, responding to the feedback and doing really well as a result. So it's not that uncommon to see applications come back again, and they often do really well. You've got a great application together as well, good links, good collaborations, even if it's not funded that particular time. And I think feel proud to have got something in. It's a big achievement as well. So yeah, I hope that's been helpful, and I will pass over to Patrick, I think now, unless you've got any questions first, Adam.
Well, I was just going to say, what I think might have surprised people by your talk that I don't even think I'd fully appreciated was that not everybody on the review board will have fully read every application that comes through. And so when they come in, I'm assuming whoever administers the program will divide those up according to your expertise, is it? Or is it just equally shared out?
A range of different things, probably. So you'll be sent all the applications to have a look over beforehand, just in terms of kind of the title and who are applicants for them. So that's the point at which you can indicate if you've got any conflicts of interest. And you can also indicate if you've got an interest in reviewing a certain application, or certainly that's how some of the panels I've worked on have operated. So it may be that you can say, I've got expertise in this area or with these methods, for example. So you may be more likely to get allocated an application for that reason, but they're also just shared out between everybody as well. Usually your first time on a funding panel, you just sit and observe as well, and you wouldn't have any allocated to you. I think in an ideal world, everybody at the funding panel will always have read all of the applications, but the level of depth you're going to put into that will depend on whether or not you've been allocated them to review. So they will have read the ones that they're reviewing at the meeting and speaking about in more depth. In an ideal world, they will have read the others, but I suspect in reality it's to varying degrees depending on how much time people have got, because there could easily be 25 applications for a meeting, and it's obviously a lot of work. They're sometimes 40, 50 pages long. So I think it's worth writing it with a view to perhaps them not reading it all.
So do you have, so you obviously, given however many you're given to review, do you still have access to those other ones if you wanted to read them?
Yeah, so everyone will have access to them all, apart from obviously the ones where you're conflicted, then you wouldn't typically have access to those. So yes, and I will try and read them all before every funding panel meeting, but there's, they take time. So I think you have to presume that they may not always have been read by every member in full.
And it's interesting. I was just looking because I got some stats to hand about when you mentioned there about resubmitting or reapplying for funding. It's quite a high rate. Something I haven't got the stat to hand. I think it was over 50% of grants got funded if you kept going.
Yeah.
I will find it by the time Patrick's finished. I'll have that stat to hand. But just to show that it's not, that perseverance really is key, that taking that feedback on board and adapting your application and resubmitting, that resubmissions to the same program that have taken on board feedback do seem to be more successful. So it is always worth doing that, unless of course it's completely ridiculous. But thank you very much, Rachael. We'll talk some more afterwards, but we're going to hear from Patrick now. So obviously what I love about this session is Rachael is great because comes from that kind of care and qualitative research as well with the NIHR background, and Patrick very much in the fundamental science space. So we've got something for everybody here today. But over to you, Patrick.
Brilliant, thanks, Andrew. And actually, just to pick up on a point there that around resubmission, one of the things that's very interesting to sort of compare and contrast between different funding bodies is that they have very, very different policies on resubmission. And so, for example, NIHR actually, I think, probably have a better way of approaching this than most. But if you look at the BBSRC and the MRC, which are funding more, maybe certainly the BBSRC, more fundamental science, actually it's very difficult to resubmit a grant that has been rejected. And this is something that's very much worth keeping in mind. For the record, I think that actually we should be allowing that, and that's a really important part of the process of funding good science is allowing a grant to evolve, but sometimes that can be very, very difficult. What I'm going to try and do now is fortunately Rachael has done an amazing job and basically covered almost all of the points which I would bring in. What I'll do is I'll try and share my screen and see whether or not this goes horribly wrong, which it did last time. Okay, good. And hopefully that's now coming through and not infinity mirroring, which it was before. So what I thought I'd do, sort of picking up on Rachael's talk, was just to give you a little bit of background on myself, to give you an idea as to the areas which I'm covering. As Adam introduced, I'm at the Royal Veterinary College. I'm a neuroscientist working mainly on Parkinson's, with a little bit of work on dementia, and actually very, very little work on animal health for a variety of different reasons. So I do a little bit of work on prion diseases. Where I've come from, I started out at the University of Manchester, worked at the Mayo Clinic on Alzheimer's for a year, and then did a PhD at the MRC Prion unit. Then spent 2 years as a visiting fellow at the National Institutes of Health over in Bethesda, before coming back to the UK and setting up my own group at UCL, then at the University of Reading, and back in 2020 moving to the Royal Veterinary College, which is where I'm based now. Now, in terms of funding bodies and grant panels that I've been involved in over the last sort of 10, 15 years now, I've been involved with quite a few, and actually I'll pick up on that as we go through this. So I'm a panel member, or committee member rather, for the BBSRC, the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, and at the moment I'm involved in Committee D, which is sort of cellular and molecular type stuff, broadly defined, but I'm also involved in the fellowship panel, Committee E, which looks at personal awards and fellowship career development. And interestingly enough, of course, these schemes and funding mechanisms have different criteria, different ways in which they're evaluated, which I think is a point to pick up from Rachael's presentation that is very, very important, thinking about how you're going to be evaluated and the mechanisms of that. I'm also part of the Parkinson's UK pool of experts, I think they call it that, but basically the reviewing and grant assessment panel that Parkinson's UK have, and I chair one of the grant panels for the MS Society, their Catalyst Award program. Previously, I've been involved in Ataxia UK, and I'm on the grant review board for Alzheimer's Research UK, and occasionally work on fellowship applications for the Alzheimer's Association, which is based over in the US. And then finally, I'm part of the pool of experts for the UKRI Future Leader Fellowship Scheme. And in a way, the reason for having all of these different badges up on the screen is that when I look at the way in which grant evaluation works with these different funding bodies, it works very, very differently across these different funding bodies. And really, I think that the first point that I'd raise, which draws upon some of the points that Rachael was raising, is make sure that you understand the process that you're entering into and that you're applying for. So understand what are the stages. Rachael mentioned the ability to respond to reviewers' comments. Some schemes allow that. The Catalyst scheme that I'm involved in at the MS Society actually doesn't. For the reason that they wanted to streamline the review process and speed it up so that you got a decision more quickly. Actually, there, the grant is viewed by reviewers and you get reviewers' comments, but it goes to the panel without those comments being rebutted. You then have an opportunity to resubmit and address those comments, but actually in the process is a one-stage process. Taking Parkinson's UK, actually what they have is they have a slightly more complicated process where you submit a pre-proposal, or essentially a letter of intent, quite a long letter of intent. You're then reviewed on that and invited to submit a full application, and you then have the opportunity to respond to reviewers' comments. So I think when you're approaching putting in a grant proposal, think about actually what is the process, when are the dates, not just the submission date, but the initial submission date, but also when are you likely to hear back from reviewers, and when are you likely to be able to respond to those. So planning that out and actually mapping it out in your calendar or your diary or however you choose to do that, actually for me is a really, really important thing. And again, picking up on Rachael's point, the process starts 9 months or so before the deadline comes around. You want to give yourself as much time as possible to develop a grant which is as competitive as possible and makes as good a case as possible. The other point that I wanted to really echo, and I love the analogy of the Sylvanian families, is thinking about your audience. And this is, I think, from the most recent Academy Awards, where for the people trying to get nominations and to get awards, basically they're talking to the American Academy of whatever it is. There's a group of people, a pool of people who they have to convince. And knowing what that audience is for your grant and for the scheme that you're applying for is absolutely critical, because in reality, what you're doing is you're talking to several different audiences. The majority of grants will go through an external review process followed by a grant panel process. And the audiences you're talking to at those two stages are very, very different. There may be overlap, but they're very distinct. In the first place, when your grantor goes out and undergoes peer review, it's likely to be viewed by people who are experts in your area. And so you need to make sure that your grant proposal, or your fellowship application proposal for that matter, has a level of detail that allows your expert peers to look at it and have confidence that what you're writing is interesting, it's exciting, but it's also achievable. So you need that level of detail in there that will convince the experts in your field. Now, you then move to talking to the grant panel, and the grant panel, using the analogy of 12 angry scientists sitting around a table, is a different audience. And in the case of Parkinson's UK or Alzheimer's Research UK, many of the people around the table will be aware of the area of research that you're involved in and that you're looking at. But actually, if you apply to some of the wider schemes, and I'm thinking here of the BBSRC or UKRI Future Leader Fellows, actually the people around the table may not have directly relevant expertise, and even the people introducing your grants may be several steps removed from your precise field. And here, this is where the simple summaries, a scientific abstract or a lay abstract, actually are absolutely critical, because you want to be able to communicate with them in language that they understand. One thing you don't want to leave anybody involved in the process, whether that's the expert reviewers or whether that's the grant panel itself, what you don't want to leave them feeling is either confused or feeling a bit dumb. You want to make what you're trying to achieve really, really clearly communicated. So one of the, as a sort of additional tip, and I can't remember, Rachel, if we'd chatted about this a little bit before. We had a brief meeting a week or so ago about this. One of the things that is very, very useful to do is to actually expose your proposals and your research ideas to people who are either outside your field or even outside of science, so that you get an idea as to whether the key points that you're trying to make are salient. Are they obvious to people reading it? Now, that's actually quite a difficult thing to do, because when you're writing a grant or a fellowship, any kind of a proposal, actually getting you're so involved in the granular detail of the proposal that quite often it's difficult to see that broader picture and that broader implications and actually how accessible the text is. And so getting your proposals read through by people, not just those who have direct expertise, maybe having sat on a panel before or something along those lines, but actually people without that expertise as well, to see how clear, what's the clarity of communication that you're using with your proposal. And there are lots of other things that I could talk about there, and I think I've gone into that horrid infinity screen thing there. I think the other point I would pick up on, and sort of going back to the idea of the different audiences you're talking to, have an idea as to, don't have an idea, know absolutely what kind of reviews will be coming through. So I talked about expert reviews for Parkinson's UK and also for Alzheimer's Research UK. Actually, there are either either people with Parkinson's reviewing the proposals, and you'll have a quite a detailed lay abstract and sort of simple communication of science part to your proposal, directly communicating with those people, with the individuals who have lived experience of the disorder. They will be reviewing your grant, and for both Parkinson's UK and for Alzheimer's Research UK, they sit on the panels, and they will be there in the grant decision-making process, and their voices are there, are heard, and are listened to. So making sure that you're working with people who have lived experience, or supporting people who are living with disorders like Alzheimer's, like Parkinson's, actually involving them in the process of developing the research is actually a really, really, really valuable thing to do. But it really does depend on the proposal and the grant scheme that you're applying to. So if you were looking at BBSRC or the MRC, actually there's much less emphasis on that. BBSRC in particular, maybe a little bit with the MRC, but knowing who's going to be looking at your grant, who's going to be commenting on it, and the groups of people and the areas of expertise that they have that will be inputting into the decision-making process, that for me is one of the key things to take away. The other thing I would pick up on from Rachael's talk as well is the idea of getting experience and seeing how those decisions are made in the grant panel environment. And that can be done in lots of different ways. As Rachael mentioned, actually a lot of schemes now have a lot of grant panels, a lot of grant funding schemes have an opportunity to sit in as observers. BBSRC do this, Parkinson's UK do it, Alzheimer's Research UK do it, of the bodies that I've been involved in. So getting that observational idea as to what's going on actually is really, really invaluable, because for me, when I was able to do that, I did that for the MRC with the MRC a number of years ago now, actually sitting in and watching the decision-making process and understanding what arguments may resonate, what are the ways in which you can present your project or proposal that resonate with the audiences that you're trying to talk to. One of the best ways to do that is to see that process live and to actually really understand what's going on. The other thing I would say is trying to get experience as a decision maker. And that can be done within your institution. Most institutions will have some kind of smaller grants, perhaps, that they award, PhD studentships, something along those lines, where actually you may be able to get experience of reviewing proposals and maybe even presenting them and talking to other members of the institution, making those decisions, building that up. Probably the most important bit of experience that I got as a starter for really understanding grant submission and what makes a good grant was volunteering as a grant panel member with Ataxia UK, which is one of the smaller charities funding research into neurodegeneration. But that experience and expertise really allowed me to understand how to go about doing this and get that experience, which is really, really invaluable. And actually, that experience then allowed me to put myself forward to the BBSRC or to the Future Leader Fellowship Scheme and say, actually, I have experience of this. So it allows you to build up that portfolio of expertise. That, I think, is a really, really invaluable thing to do. I would also say that where you can and where time and resources allow it, get the expertise of reviewing grants. Most funding bodies are desperate for reviewers, and when you look through a list of how many people have to be asked to review something for a grant panel before they actually get enough reviews in, actually you get an idea as to how challenging it is for awarding bodies to get those reviewers. So if you have an opportunity, if you're invited to review a grant, could be for a small grant, could be for an overseas funding body. Many of the grants that I reviewed early on were actually for overseas funding bodies. Getting that kind of expertise and experience actually is a really valuable thing as well. And I really encourage anybody listening, putting together grants or looking to put together grants, that's a really, really valuable way to get to do things. I've no idea how long I've talked for, Adam, but that's probably long enough listening to me, and we can get some questions and discussion going.
No, not too long at all. Thank you, Patrick. There were a couple of questions actually from people there, particularly asking about opportunities to get involved in being a grant reviewer. We should say, I mean, so the NIHR, if you're in the UK, which I appreciate not everybody in the audience or who's watching this back later on YouTube or in the community will be in the UK, they certainly advertise these positions, and they're it's almost a perpetual process. There are so many grant review boards in the NIHR that they are constantly looking for new people, and you don't get paid. Do you get paid? Do you? Good question, Pat. In the NIHR, you don't. Do you get any compensation for time at all, or expenses, or anything like that? Yeah.
Very, very dependent upon the funding body. So for Parkinson's UK, Alzheimer's Research UK, absolutely not. For the BBSRC, for the MRC, for UKRI, actually, if you're a part of a grant panel or a committee, actually you do get a small honorarium, basically, which by no means covers the time and dedication and so on that you put into it, but it's a small reflection of the cost to you in terms of putting stuff in. So it depends on the funding body. UKRI tend to do that if you're part of a committee, not for reviewing, but for the actual committees.
So I posted some links in the chat there, certainly to the NIHR ones. They have a page where all these opportunities are advertised, and they've got a particular one at the moment for early career researchers, who, particularly in social care, for NHS commissioners, local governments and things like that. So, and as you say, also the opportunity to go observe. Rachel, you mentioned that you've been to observe quite a few. I know certainly Alzheimer's Research UK now invite external reviewers. UKRI have recently just advertised this as well. I think we listed that on our website a few weeks ago. If you go to our homepage and scroll a couple of pages along, you'll find the advert from that. And Alzheimer's Society don't, but they do run mock review boards at their early career researcher retreats that they recreate the real experience. And they're advertising at the moment. Their ECR retreat is happening in July in Northampton, and you can apply to attend that event. So this is a big question. I imagine you get asked this all the time when you do this. Most common mistakes you see in unsuccessful applications. Rachel, you take that first.
Okay. I mean, I covered a few of them in my slides before. I think the biggest mistakes are just having not pulled together people with enough expertise in the first place to then put together a really good application. So if you haven't got a good team in place, if you are doing a study that involves 3 different types of methods and is on a particular topic, you need to have expertise in all those different methods and that topic on the team. And it really is obvious when that isn't the case. And if you're proposing to do a feasibility study or a randomized control trial and you don't have trials input, you don't have statistical input perhaps, or health economics input, those sections of the application just look weak as a result. And that's the other key flaw then is applications that haven't said enough about the research methods or haven't tackled those methods in the right kind of way. So there's just lots of queries, a lack of clarity, not enough detail, full stop on the methods. And that's the other element that I think is the main reason applications fall down. I think certainly for the NIHR, they have a pretty standardized approach to the different headings in the application now. And there's quite a few headings that encourage you to write things about different aspects of the background before you get to the methods. And I think one of the things people fall down on is therefore feeling like they need to put too much information about the background. You need to write enough to show you've got a really good sense of existing literature, that there's a clear gap, that it's a really important topic for X, Y, and Z reasons. But you want, I would say, no more than 1/3 of that application to be used up on the background literature, because otherwise you just fall really short of space for the methods. And that's the other mistake I think people make. The decisions are being made mainly on the methods, not on the background literature.
And that's like, I mean, we see this all the time, don't we? It's every presentation you see at a conference that starts by telling you what dementia is.
Yes.
And how many people are affected by it and what's the underlying kind of mechanism behind it. You go, yeah, we're all here, we know that. So I can get that. Whilst you need to give enough detail to show that this is an important area, but you don't have to recreate every, that makes absolute sense. What about from your side, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd echo that for sure. Making sure that you've got the right people involved in the proposal is the really important starting point, because that will through the expert reviews or through the grant panel or through both, that will become apparent. And is really going to be. And if the reviewers or the grant panel don't think that you've got the right people involved to actually carry out the research, then you're not going to get funded, or it massively reduces your chances of getting funded. I mean, I pick up on a slightly different point, which is technicality. And it goes back to thinking about who your audience is, because you can have a huge amount of technical detail in grant process. And I've seen many grants which have a huge amount of technical detail. Actually, there's almost certainly there's going to be a limited number of people who really take on board all of that technical detail. And so having preliminary data, for example, which is really, really wonderful and comprehensive, but is crammed into a figure that is just uninterpretable to the non-expert eye, actually that may make it much more difficult for people to make the argument that your grant should be funded and not another grant. So thinking about the level of technical detail, making sure that it is cohesive and that it's compelling, but at the same time making sure that, even if it's including a cartoon explaining what it is you're trying to do before including a bit of information that demonstrates that you can do it. It's important to have that demonstration that you can do it, but actually it needs to be understood within the context as well. So I think that's one of the things that I would pick up on. It's important to have that technical detail, but don't over-egg it. Don't have so much of it that you lose your audience. The other point, which is very, very common, is having the really wonderful stuff right at the end of the grant. Have some wonderful stuff at the end of the grant, but remember that the people reading through these applications, either as reviewers or as grant panels, might have many grants to look through. And so actually, if you've lost their enthusiasm and their attention in the first page, you're very unlikely to get it back. So make sure that you've got enough of the key points and the bits that make your grant fundable in that the opening salvo, in the abstract for sure, or the scientific summary, but in that first page, make it absolutely clear why your grant should be funded and what it is about your grant that's unique. Why is it worth funding? Make sure that that's upfront.
So in a way, then, is there an element of that which is almost kind of treating this like a bit like a job application? I mean, we've all been told lots in these days that we have to be better at selling ourselves in our job applications and sounding upbeat. I mean, you almost want your grant application to sound, you've got to sound excited by it, right? I mean, you need to say that this is going to be important, this is exciting, and sound excited in the language you come across, and make sure that that's right there at the start. Don't suddenly become excited in the last paragraph to say this has got, this could transform care, or this could transform our understanding of disease. You need to get that right up front.
The flip side of that, just Rachel, you go ahead.
I'm going to say what you're going to say in a minute. You say it first, and let's see if we agree.
Let's see
we both did that.
The same thing. So the other side of that is don't oversell. There you go. Because again, the reviewers, and especially on the grant panel, who they will have seen lots of. Sometimes you've got people with many decades of research experience. They will have a feel as to whether you're pitching it at the right level and saying, okay, actually, we're going to change this and this. We're not going to cure dementia with this grant, but we're going to lay the foundations that allow you to do that. So make sure that, be excited. And I think that is absolutely critical. If you can't sound excited about the grant, how is the person presenting your grant at a panel going to sound excited about it? That's the way in which you need to think about it. But
because
don't get carried away.
For you, aren't they? And you both mentioned the importance of having good collaborators, firm foundations, the expertise that you need on the grant. If you're an early career researcher that's perhaps not very well networked and connected, do you have any tips for how you might approach finding those people to take on this journey and this application with you?
Yeah, I think look at who you're citing and look at who are the other people who've got expertise in this area, in the topic. Be mindful of how you're going to work together. So there are some people that might be big names, but have they got the time to work with you on a grant? So sometimes it might be easier if geographically people are a little bit nearer. So if you're going to have some face-to-face meetings, that's going to be feasible. Look at the initial responses you get from people. I think, some people may just be too busy to reply at all, but, some people may reply and be enthusiastic, others not so much. So I think approach people with an element of caution as well. So you're not saying straight up, I'd definitely like to work with you. I'm just wondering if this might be of interest. So you've both got a sort of a get out clause if it turns out not to be the best thing.
And don't be afraid to do that, right? Because it's a nice thing to be asked. I think it doesn't matter how senior you are, somebody writing to you and inviting you to be on their, to be involved in something, nobody's ever going to be upset by that. I mean, they might get lots of them. Even if it's slightly tokenistic. Let's say you who the big name is. This, you're in fundamental science and you're going to go ask, who's a big name? Let's say you're going to go ask John Hardy to be on your grant. Now, for a fact, John Hardy's not really going to be doing, his name's on it, but he's probably not going to be doing a great deal. Does that make a difference? Does having that big name on that grant, simply through their rather passive involvement, make a difference? I mentioned John, so I should come to you there for that one, Patrick.
Having worked with John for more years than I care to admit, I would say I had a full head of hair when I started working with John. But
you might say no. I mean, don't get me wrong. They might always say no, but I mean,
so
should you aim high, with low expectations that they're not really going to do much, but it will make a big difference, or does it make a big difference?
So I think you need to be careful with that. I think it is potentially a very valuable way to do it, but if something is obviously tokenistic in that you've got someone on the grant, but it's not clear from the research proposal actually what they're doing, and the way in which I think about it, if I'm talking with someone and they say, oh, it'd be great to have you involved in this grant, the way in which I respond to that is I am almost always, maybe even too much, happy to be involved and contribute to grant proposals, to projects, and so on.
You might regret saying that.
I know.
Rachael says the same, by the way.
But the way in which I think about it is, what's the value that I add? So does my presence on the proposal, this is a question that I'll ask collaborators and colleagues and so on. Is my presence on that grant going to strengthen it? Is it going to make it a stronger case when it gets to panel? And the way in which I could do that, is if I'm directly involved in the research, and that should be obvious from the proposal. The other way to think about it is that sometimes you can get the value from leaders in the field, experienced researchers in slightly different roles, depending upon the scheme that you're applying for. So for a fellowship scheme, actually, this is particularly pertinent, but you see the same thing maybe in some grant proposals as well. Having mentors involved, having somebody like John in different fields involved as a mentor, as an advisor to the project, having a panel of experts who contribute and oversee and help contribute to the research process. This is particularly important for larger scale grants, but is something that you can include in smaller scale grants as well. So I think making sure that and actually to step sideways a little bit, I think that's also very true of involving people with direct experience of what it is you're researching. So if you have somebody involved who is a carer of somebody with dementia, and you've written them into the grant proposal, actually making it clear what they are doing, what they're contributing. In that case, actually, it would be entirely appropriate to make sure they're remunerated for what they do, given travel expense, making sure that so it becomes clear that it's not a tokenistic thing at all. And I think that's what shines through at a grant panel.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that and just add, if you involve somebody like John, I'm going to hazard a guess that John's quite expensive. So be careful that, it is definitely going to add to your application. I also would say if you're an ECR applying, or this is a first grant or an early grant, make sure you've built into the team people who are going to support you with just the management of the grant. Certainly NIHR, Research for Patient Benefit is the funding panel that I've just spent 5 years on. We very much welcome applications from early career researchers, But what we would want to see is a really well supported early career researcher. So somebody else who's got a lot more expertise in managing a grant, who's going to support that person with a good FTE to manage their first grant or one of their early grants.
So that comes back to the mentor, having people on there as mentors, as you suggested, as alternatives to that. And you mentioned RFPB there, which we're increasingly, the Academy, I know, are encouraging people to apply for that, because that's one of the grant schemes that doesn't fully spend out, isn't it? They have sufficient funding usually for most applications that come through if the quality's there.
As far as I'm aware, I mean, as a funding panel member, I never really had my hands on the coffers, but I think NIHR often has really good amounts of funding to spend, and it's never usually a decision about there being too many applications to fund. It's more about whether or not an application is fundable, and sometimes it can be tricky to put enough through. So definitely apply.
Which I know isn't going to be the case for lots of the grant boards you sit on, Patrick. In fact, I've got a question about how you decide between fundable ones, but let's go to our audience. I don't want to miss out on audience questions.
No, I was going to say there's a few in the chat.
There are, so I'm going to come to these. So Russell asks, when submitting an improved proposal to the same funding body, do they have a memory for repeat applications and take account if they've improved from before, or are the reviewers entirely different and treated as brand new? I guess part of that's going to come back to, as you said, some that do or don't allow repeat applications. But if they do allow, do they have a memory? In your experience, I guess, Rachel, have you seen them come through and you knew that this was the second time around?
Yes, so I can speak from an NIHR predominantly point of view, and then Patrick may come in with some other views on the panels he's been involved in. But certainly from the NIHR, there is a section on the application form that will ask you, has this been submitted to RFPB, for example, or anywhere else before? And if you say yes, it opens up another section for you to specify what the feedback was before and what you've done in response to it. And that, to me, is an advantage. It's giving you some extra space on the application form that other people don't have. And it gives you the opportunity to say, this did go somewhere else before. We've taken that feedback on board and we've done X, Y, and Z in response to that. So if you do a good job of that, you can really add some strength to your application. Whether or not it gets seen by the same panel will depend a little bit on whether the panel has changed and whether or not it goes back to exactly the same panel or not. But they will potentially try and use some of the same reviewers again, so there is some continuity there, but it's not always possible. I don't know if your experience is different there, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, very dependent upon the funding body. So for Alzheimer's Research UK, actually, again, yeah, they're very similar. There's a question: has this previously been submitted? Parkinson's UK do something similar, and actually, they explicitly ask, "What have you changed?" So is this just you submitting the same grant with a few minor tweaks, or is this a substantially changed proposal? So I think that there is, and that comes up when you're looking through, when you're re-reviewing the proposals. It is fairly obvious that that this is a resubmitted proposal that's hopefully been amended and improved since the initial submission. So I think that memory is there. One of the challenges, I think, and this is in a way true of submitting, reviewing and publishing papers, but there's no guarantee that it will be seen by the same people for lots of different reasons. And the pitfall of that is that what you may get is a different list of questions and a different list of things that the particular reviewer or grant proposer have in their mind. So that's one of the things to be aware of that may come down the road. You may actually get very, very different comments, and you may have addressed one set of comments with the from the first submission, but actually it may even take you back to your first submission with the comments from the second submission. So it's not a foolproof process in any way, shape or form.
And it's tricky as well, isn't it? Because some of these grant, you mentioned Alzheimer's Research UK there. I mean, some of their programs actually only open once a year. So by the time you're reapplying, I mean, things have moved on. I mean, the science has moved on. I mean, I don't know about you, but things I pick up now that I wrote a year ago, I very rarely don't have a completely new mindset that makes me want to rewrite the whole thing. I mean, some of the papers you published 2 years ago, if you were to go and revisit them now, you'd be saying different things, wouldn't you? So I guess NIH is a little bit different because they open multiple rounds. You can literally find out you haven't been funded, and then there's probably that same grant scheme's opening again straight away, so you can you can make
you
the
can,
changes.
although I'd caution you not to put it back in too quickly, to give yourself enough time to make the changes. But yes, there's lots more opportunities to put it back in. And maybe it's just worth very quickly, but I know we haven't got much time left. Someone's asked a related question earlier on just about if an application gets rejected, do you change everything in that application when applying a second time round? The short answer is no. Don't start again from scratch. Hopefully you had a fairly good stab at it the first time around. Change the things that you got feedback on, and maybe go to some other people and ask for some new eyes on it as well. Go, this is the feedback I got. What do you think I should change? Some people have got more expertise, because sometimes you have to read between the lines a little bit of the feedback as well, I think, to know what it is they're asking you to do. But yeah, don't change it.
If you were missing expertise in a certain area, I mean, they're obviously some of the easier ones to resolve, is finding that, or making it clearer that somebody on there actually has that expertise, but you just didn't make that clear the first time around. Next question was, any suggestions for writing grants looking at rare conditions where public impact would be inherently small? I guess, Patrick, you mentioned Prion disease there as well, which is obviously quite rare with the CJD and things like that. Do you have experience on that? How do you make a panel really care about the disease area? I guess in dementias, you know, they say, oh, we're open for everything, but if you're applying for something that's really niche, how do you make them excited by that?
So I think that there's a couple of ways in which you can do that. So the first thing to do, and going back to one of the things that Rachael mentioned earlier on, is actually that there are often small funding bodies, small charities that specifically support rare conditions. And so seeking them out and working with them, maybe getting small pots of money to get you started on stuff, is a really good way to get experience of the grant process, but also a really good way to start developing a bit of momentum around a particular question or topic. Equally, if there are institutional mini grants, pump priming type things, actually that might be a good way to think about for rare disorders. I think there are two things with rare disorders that you can pick up upon, one of which is the generalizability, and saying, actually, this is a very rare condition. There are 2 families worldwide, let's say, but actually the insights that we get from looking at the disease mechanisms and process here will provide insight to the broader field of dementia. And I can think of a number of examples where that is demonstrably the case, historical examples, and there will be many more that we aren't taking advantage of. So actually, I'd argue quite strongly that we need to take more advantage of these rarer disorders, depending upon how you sort of put them into different categories. The other thing, and this perhaps is speaking more towards the MRC or the BBSRC, the broader funding bodies, is so many aspects of basic biology have been illuminated by looking at very rare conditions. And to take a dementia example, the whole field of intramembranous proteolysis actually was accelerated and driven by the identification of the presenilin mutations in Alzheimer's disease. So there you have an example of relatively speaking, rare mutations in the broader context of dementia as a global disease burden. But actually the fundamental biology that we understood from those, set aside all of the disease mechanisms side, which is really, really important, but actually the impact on fundamental biology has been huge. And Prion diseases and CJD, another clear example of that. There have been 2 Nobel Prizes for work specifically on prion diseases. And the insights that we've gained from those in terms of fundamental biology and the rules of life, actually, if you can find a way to plug that into your application, and actually I'd say that more generally, showing that generalizability, the broader impact and importance of your research, those are really good things to include anyway. So those are the things that I would flag up: the generalizability within a disorder or within a broader disease field, but also the biological impact of understanding a particular disease mechanism in what may be a very rare disorder.
I think that's the same could be said in care as well, right, Rachael? I mean, you know, you're making it generalizable. And we did a podcast on this a few weeks ago. We had Charlie Arbour on the podcast a few weeks ago talking about familial British dementia, which only a handful of families have, yet they've just received a Race Against Dementia Ignition Fund to enable them to do that on exactly that same purpose. So if you're interested in that, go have a listen to that podcast, because they talk about this condition and how they're now working.
That was one of the examples which I had in my mind.
Perfect. We had another question. Some funders, NIHR, MRC, will give feedback from external reviewers between stages 1 and stage 2 applications. Do I treat external reviewers' feedback equally as the feedback I got from the first stage? Rachel, do you want to take that first?
To a large degree, I think, yes. What you will get is slightly different feedback sometimes. There'll be potentially more points pulled out, and I think I'd want to look across the reviews, because there'll often be, say, 4 or 5, to see what maybe some of the key or recurring or the most important points. You know, you should be an expert in this area, so you should be able to go, actually, that feels like quite an important point. So I think I'd want to take that feedback on board. And certainly what will happen at the review panel meeting, if external reviews have been received between stage 1 and stage 2, they will be used as part of the feedback given to the rest of the panel at stage 2. So they will absolutely be taken into account. Don't overlook, though, most importantly, you will have been asked to do certain things by the panel between stage 1 and stage 2, and that in your actual application at stage 2, I presume this is the case with other funders as well, but certainly with the NIHR, you'll be asked to provide a response to that feedback. So you'll be asked to address, let's say, 6 or 8 different points. Make sure you really clearly address each of those and do that really well, you know, even if you don't think it's a great point, thank you so much for this. You know, we've thought about this, we've done that, or we haven't done that for this really good reason. So absolutely focus on that, but do look at the external feedback and take that into account.
Exactly the same thing on an ESRC grant that I was on early last year, that we addressed those point by point. There's another question here, is going back to our discussion from earlier. Before asking somebody to be involved in your grant, do you think it's important to have a connection with that person, or is it okay to approach a stranger? I don't know. What do you think? Have you been approached, Patrick?
Occasionally, yeah. And actually, I find those emails out of the blue sometimes some of the more interesting emails. And I think that the other way, and I've done this the other way around a couple of times, where I've been interested in an area of research and I've essentially cold emailed somebody and said, I work on this, I'm really interested in the stuff you do. And sometimes that works. Sometimes I'll go back to you and go, you know what, that's really interesting. Could we set up a call? I think that you have to be prepared for a low level of responses in that case. And don't be offended by people not responding. Because it's probably not.
I wrote a blog on how to craft the perfect introduction of this email. I've written a blog on how to do cold emailing. So go have a look for exactly the same purpose. Well, we've actually over time now, but what I did, so I had a little exercise. I took a couple of podcast transcripts and some of our blogs from our website talking to this topic as well, including some feedback from people who attended AR UK. So beginning of last year, we had all the people who attended AR UK's grant review board wrote blogs for us on what they observed. So do go check those out on our website. I will post a link in there, but I fed all of those resources into a chat tool and said, give me 10 top tips from everything I'm telling you in these blogs. And this is what it came up with. And I think it repeats exactly what you've all just said. So read the guidelines carefully, first of all. Every funder has very specific criteria. Don't assume that they're all the same, and don't assume that it's the same from one round to the next, because they change. Certainly Alzheimer's Research UK just introduced the requirement of a narrative CV on theirs. That was new this time around. Alzheimer's Society went to a 2-page letter of expression of interest form, which again, we didn't even talk about expressions of interest. We could do an entirely separate webinar on expressions of interest and how you craft those differently to an application. I'll make that happen. The next point was tell a clear and cohesive story. So make sure your proposal is logically structured, easy to follow, and enthusiastic, as we said, but not overly ambitious. Justify everything, clearly explain why your methods, your budget, and your team are the best choices. Address potential weaknesses. Reviewers will spot them, so acknowledge and mitigate any risks up front. So if you have them, they can't call you out on something if you said, I appreciate there's not in this area. You acknowledge it, because a reviewer can't reject something by saying, oh, well, they've not done this, because you said we've not done that. And then you can You can, but you've already said you're going to work on it. Think about reviewers' perspective, write concisely, avoid jargon. Many reviewers aren't necessarily specialists in exactly that area, particularly in areas of fundamental science, where there are so many niche areas that you could be involved in. I think that you both said that as well. Get feedback before submitting. Ask your colleagues, your mentors, review your application critically. So take a look. Be strategic with collaborators. A well-balanced team, making sure you've got all the expertise in there, will strengthen your bid. Prepare for rejection. It is common. We were looking at this, something like Alzheimer's Research UK fellowships at the moment. If you're applying for one of those, I think it's something like 15 to 20% are funded. So it's not always about you. There's an element of luck to this. I think, you get the right reviewers on a good day when they're, Yvonne Couch has written some great blogs for us on the role of luck in this. So don't take everything personally. And finally, start early. Rushed applications rarely succeed. Give yourself time to draft, redraft, review, refine. So even if you you see something on our website now, the deadlines are so short now. I mean, we've just opened some grant applications at the end of January that gave you till the end of March to apply. That's short. But if you knew last year that was going to be coming out, you could start thinking about this. We gave this advice on a fellowship webinar a few weeks ago, which is start thinking at least 6 months ahead. Have those, even if you're not writing it down, start to work out in your head what it is you're going to do. And I think we're really lucky to have so many conferences and webinars and things to go to, people we can talk to about these things, to start to noodle around these ideas and build up some cool stuff. It also, as well, going to those conferences lets you really keep your finger on the pulse of what that funder is particularly interested in right now. So, you can look at what got funded last time. Where are the hot topics? These are things that they might likely to see. Keeping on top of trends, I think, can make a difference. Hopefully you don't both disagree with those things. I think this sounds reasonable. Thank you so much for sticking with us 8 minutes over time, but I'm really grateful to the incredible Dr. Rachael Kelley, the unstoppable Professor Patrick Lewis. You've both been brilliant. Thank you so much. And we'll be back in the Salon next Wednesday to talk about something else that I can't remember. But I'll see you next week. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.